The high floor flexed under Suoma's boots, warming where her weight crossed it and cooling behind her into a long, pale trail of her own passage. The Iset would read that trail later, they read everything later, so she walked carefully as one walks across wet paper. The audience sump opened ahead of her down a sloping corridor whose walls were the muscled inner surface of something that had once been, and in some ways still was, alive. The three other delegates wore translator collars at the throat. The collars produced approximations of Iset speech by means of a small piezoelectric resonator, and the resonators had been calibrated by acoustic engineers who had never spent a single hour listening through a spinal harness. Suoma wore a spinal harness. It had bruised her vertebrae in 8 identifiable bands over the past 2 rotations, and she had learned in that time to receive the Iset's middle register the way a human child learns the difference between her mother's voice and a stranger's, not through translation but through long, irrational bodily attention. Keithra of the long resonance occupied the sump's lower chamber. She was the size of a cargo lifter and the color of wet bronze, and her thorax was a single seamless resonant plate that vibrated at frequencies low enough to displace dust on the floor. She produced the formal welcoming cadence. The translator collars rendered it as, "Honored strangers, our cycles are made longer by your visit." What Keithra had actually said in the broader hive band that the collars could not hear was approximately, "Note for the attendants, the tall noisemaker trembles in its long bones, the short noisemaker shifts its weight, the bone quiet one is possibly defective. Proceed with the recitation of trade terms, remember that they do not understand, we are doing them a kindness." Suoma understood every word. She kept her face entirely still. She had practiced stillness in front of a mirror for 3 months before her first rotation, and she practiced it now while the Iset attendants conferred openly above her about the strange wet softness of human eyes, the way the human pulse showed at the throat, the regrettable evolutionary accident that had given a species hands and tools but no proper thorax to speak with. The trade terms were recited. The trade terms were approximately fair. The delegate to her left, Ambassador Baron, who had given 6 years of his career to this treaty, pressed his collar's confirmation toggle, and the collar produced the courtesy phrase for "thank you for your kindness," which the Iset received with the polite tolerance one offers a clever animal's bell. Keithra's compound eye, the one tilted toward the delegation, registered Suoma's bone stillness one more time before the audience closed. "Possibly defective," she said again to her attendants. "Watch it, defective specimens sometimes signal contagion." Suoma walked out of the audience sump with her face entirely still. In her cabin, she sat on the bunk and unbuckled the harness from her spine and laid it across her knees. The plate had bruised her again, a new band above the older bands, and she pressed her thumb into it gently, feeling the shape of every word the Iset had said about her body. She did not weep. She had not wept since her first rotation, when she had understood for the first time that the species she had given her career to considered her a noisemaker, and had spent 40 minutes lying on the floor of a supply closet making no sound while her ribcage worked. She had decided then, on the closet floor, that she was going to learn to speak. The technique had taken her 14 months. It required a resonator pressed flat against her sternum, a particular hum produced from the diaphragm rather than the throat, and a tongue position no human language used. It did not produce real Iset speech. It produced the harness's translation of her ribcage's harmonics into the Iset register, which was approximately what a hatchling produced before its thorax matured. She had not yet used it in front of an Iset. She was still deciding whether she would. She lay back on the bunk and put one hand flat on her sternum and breathed. Outside her cabin's small porthole, the brown dwarf Mehet hung sullen and red, throwing a slow shadow across the curve of the hive station that the Iset oriented their cycles by. In the hive creche below the audience sump, third instar hatchlings were being taught the opening phrase of their first lesson, the vibration a queen made when a new mind was learning. Suoma could not hear it. The frequency was too low to pass through walls, but she knew the shape of it. She had been practicing the next line for 14 months. The emergency came at 04:11 station cycle, and it was not strictly a klaxon. It was a vibration in the hive floor that ran along the corridor walls and woke Suoma not through her ears but through the bones of her hip against the bunk. She was upright before she understood why. The harness was on her spine before her cabin door opened. She knew the vibration's shape, the swarm-medic convergence, the same call she had heard in archival recordings when a hive section had been breached by a molting predator 3 rotations ago. In the corridor she ran into Ambassador Baron, who was shouting into his collar, and the collar was producing nothing recognizable. "Suoma, the hauler, they docked at the wrong lock, 5 of our people." "How long?" she said. 11 minutes, maybe 9, the collars aren't reaching anybody. She did not let him finish. She walked past him toward the council chamber, the spinal harness humming faintly against her vertebrae as it picked up the medic swarm's converging signature. The ISET waste disposal protocol treated a contaminated lock as a hive immune event. They would sterilize the chamber. They did not know there were human bodies inside it, because the human distress signal was being produced by a clever animal's bell. The council chamber was full. Kithra of the long resonance was on the lower dais, her thorax plate vibrating at the command frequency that directed the medic swarm. 6 attendants surrounded her. The human ambassador's collar was producing an urgent confirmation of receipt loop into a room that registered it as background noise. Suoma walked past the ambassador. She walked past the attendants. She knelt on the chitin floor at the foot of Kithra's dais and pressed the resonator of her harness against her own sternum, hard enough to feel the cartilage flex. She closed her eyes. She breathed from her diaphragm. She produced the hum she had practiced for 14 months, modulated by her tongue, shaped by the small muscles of her ribcage that no human had ever before trained to do this work. The harness translated it. She said, in formal hive address in the cadence proper to a junior addressing a long resonance node. Honored node. Your medics will kill 5 of us in 11 minutes. The error is ours. Permit me to describe the error. The room went still. It was not a stillness like a human silence. It propagated through the chitin floor itself, every attendant's thorax plate ceasing its subvocal hum in the same half-second, the floor going abruptly cold beneath Suoma's knees. Kithra turned the full plate of her thorax toward Suoma. The compound eye tilted, the mandibles opened and very slowly closed. Kithra produced a phrase. The harness rendered it as, that cannot have come from that body. It was not a question, it was a thing one said when a category had broken. Suoma did not move. She said, the body has learned, the body is a hatchling. The body asks the long resonance to hold the medic swarm for 90 seconds and to listen to the rest of the description. Behind her, the ambassador had stopped talking. He had stopped because the caller had finally produced something he understood, which was the absence of any further use for the caller. Kithra signaled with a flex of her left mandible plate. Her senior attendant produced a counter-cadence into the floor, and somewhere 2 corridors away the medic swarm broke and divided. Half continued toward the contaminated lock. Half began to grow a chitinous bulkhead around the hauler's airlock from the outside, sealing the 5 human bodies behind a wall the sterilizing agents could not pass. Suoma described the error. She described it in ISET structural vocabulary because the ISET had no word for ship but 11 words for extruded chamber. She used the word for misrouted egg tube to describe the airlock, which was approximate but understood. Her diaphragm cramped twice. Her sternum by the 3rd minute was producing a fine hot pain she would later learn was a stress fracture in the costal cartilage. She did not stop. When she had finished, Kithra dismissed every other being from the chamber, every attendant, every human, every recording drone with one short rotational signal that the harness rendered dryly as, out. Suoma stayed kneeling. The queen produced, very slowly, the opening phrase of a hatchling's first lesson. The vibration was so low Suoma felt it in her teeth before she heard it in the harness. It was the phrase by which a long resonance node addressed a mind that was learning. It was the phrase nobody outside the hive should ever have heard. She was asking Suoma to try the next line. Suoma tried the next line. Her ribcage hurt. The cartilage hurt. The line came out wrong in the 2nd case ending and correct in the 3rd, and Kithra produced a sound the harness after a moment rendered as, hatchling accent, patient, the accent of a hatchling that listened for a long time before it spoke. Then, after another long pause in a register Suoma did not know existed, stay. Suoma stayed. 3 weeks later in her bunk she lay with her sternum wrapped in medical foam and hummed very quietly with her eyes closed. The crack in the cartilage was a small bright pain that moved when she breathed. She was practicing the case endings she had got wrong in the council chamber. The Concord Treaty had not been ratified. The ISET Hive Council had retracted 6 of its clauses on the grounds that they had been drafted under the misapprehension that the human signatories were incapable of understanding the terms, and the ISET did not sign documents with parties who could not read them. The human delegation had been furious for 2 days, then appalled for 1, and then, when Suoma had testified by tight beam with the audience sump side channel recording attached, quiet. The renegotiation was underway. Suoma was the only working channel. Her ribcage was being asked to do, 10 hours a day, what it had been trained to do for 40 seconds. On the 7th day, an old hive builder named Theth of the Slow Mandible had offered through Kithra to grow her a resonator. A chitinous chamber the size of a thumb bonded to her sternum, harvested from a queen's donation stock. What the isset grew for hatchlings whose thoraxes were slow to mature, reversible. Only a high-resonance node produced tissue that would not be rejected. Kithra had offered her own 3 times. The human delegation had forbidden it. The chief medical officer had used the phrase unacceptable biological dependency on alien tissue in his memo. Ambassador Barron had asked her quietly in her cabin if she understood the political implications. Suoma had said yes. He had said, don't. She had made the appointment anyway. The alcove off the hive creche was warm. The chitinous shelf was still faintly warm from a hatchling's body. Theth had explained that hatchling warmth eased the bonding. Kithra was present because the donation was from her own resonance line. The queen's enormous body curved over the shelf, and her mandible plates produced the low cadence a long resonance node produced for a young thing about to be hurt and cert to be all right. The procedure took 11 minutes. The pain was bright and brief, and then it was a slow heat under her sternum that the foam absorbed. When they let her sit up, she took one long breath, and the breath went down into a chamber that had not been there an hour before, and the chamber answered. She produced an isset phrase without the harness, the simplest one, the one a hatchling produced when it first understood its body could speak. Here, I am here. In the doorway, 6 third-instar hatchlings had been watching. They had been told only that an elder of an unusual line was being grown into her speech. When Suoma produced the phrase, the smallest no name yet, mandibles still soft, crossed the alcove with the half-skidding gait of a young isset on a smooth surface, and pressed one tympanic plate against the warm spot on Suoma's sternum. It said in the simplest hive greeting, "Elder, you are here." Suoma answered fluently. Kithra, who had lived for 140 cycles listening to the bodies of her own kind, watched the hatchling register the human as kin. She produced in a register that was not in any treaty document and would not be a thought cadence the harness would have rendered as, I have made this, I did not intend to make this. The cycle that ends with my death will not end with my last hatchling. It will end with a stranger's child who knows my name. I find that I am not afraid. In the weeks that followed, the treaty was rewritten. 2 clauses were drafted, first in isset structural vocabulary and translated outward into human language. The first time an alien grammar had been the source text. A school was negotiated, 10 human linguists, 10 isset hatchlings, a shared creche on the Mehit station. 3 other species watching from a polite distance took notes. Suoma stayed on the station, the graft healed, her ribcage learned to produce the lower registers without pain. Her hair went gray on the station, and she taught in the creche, and learned to say things in isset that did not translate into human language at all, about cycles and resonance and the particular warmth of a shelf just left by a young body. When Kithra of the long resonance entered her final molt, 21 cycles later, the hatchling who had first pressed its tympanic plate to Suoma's sternum was a senior attendant. She stood at the side of the dais and produced the closing cadence for a long resonance node. Suoma stood beside her. They produced the cadence together in 2-part harmony, the older isset present recognized as a form their kind had not used in 900 cycles, a form requiring 2 bodies of different shape to make one phrase. The phrase was the one Kithra had first offered Suoma in the dismissed council chamber. It meant, approximately, stay. In the creche, the small isset hatchlings learned the cadence that had no name yet, and the human children learned it beside them, and down in the warm chitin of the hive a new voice, human-shaped, isset fluent, neither and both, produced the opening phrase of a hatchling's first lesson into the listening floor.